Good afternoon. It's great to see you again. How many of you were here actually, let me ask it the other way. How many of you were not here this morning? Okay, good. So the first thing I'll say then is you missed a really good session this morning. And the good news is we've videoed it. It'll be on the Teaching and Learning Collaborative website next week. And if you're interested in things like promotion and tenure and excellence of teaching in a research university, although it'll be a long video, I think it will be very much worth watching. I just found it enthralling from beginning to end, and I think it'll include not only Lee Schulman's talks, but some very interesting remarks that were made by the Provost just before Lee spoke. My first teaching day and our first teaching day was last year, and I was just watching the comments that I made this time last year, and I said that I was so intimidated by seeing what has to happen behind the scenes for something like this to happen. I was amazed that events like this happened at all because it involves so many people doing so much work. The person who I really want to single out is not a dean, but perhaps she deserves to be someday. Cassandra Wiseman has done heroic work for months, and she'll be overseeing the start of our planning for Teaching Day 2013 next week. So I really hope you'll give Cassandra a round of applause because she's been wonderful. I'd like to thank the deans and department heads who helped spread the word about how important an event this is in external relations and GW Today for publicizing it. The academic technologies staff, especially Michelle Valadez, Cindy Gustafson, and Gabby Pisani. Staff here at Jack Morton Auditorium, Dennis Chiaffi, and the entire Teaching and Learning Collaborative staff. Folks you've seen circulating around you. It's quite a crew, and they learned a lot from last year. They've worked really hard at making this something that would run smoothly. It has, and therefore it makes it a pleasure and very painless for people like me just to get to stand up in front of the bright lights and talk to you. Few items for your to-do list. If you were here this morning, you would have heard these. To make sure that your junior colleagues know about the faculty learning community for junior faculty. This is really an extraordinary program and an opportunity for junior faculty who, as one person put it to me last year, he said, I've only got a fixed number of hours really that I could devote to my teaching because research is so important, but I want those hours to be absolutely as effective as possible, and that's why I really enjoyed this program. Secondly, the guidelines for teaching awards are going to be coming out soon. And after some suggestions this morning, we'll see if we can do some things to increase the amount of the awards. I thought those were good suggestions myself. And also make sure that your colleagues who teach mathematics and statistics know that we'll have a day devoted expressly to the teaching of math and statistics coming up later this term. When I first encountered Ken Bain's book, What the Best College Professors Do, it was immediately plausible to me because many years ago I was involved as a funder of a study which used somewhat different methods than Ken did, but reached very similar conclusions. That study was done by a woman named Carol Schneider, who at that time was at the University of Chicago and is now head of the Association of American Colleges and Universities. Carol and her colleagues were interested in what distinguished excellent teachers, what made them different from average teachers in colleges. And the study began like this, and the methodology was interesting enough that I think it's worth describing in a little bit of detail. They started with 4 institutions. These were bachelor's programs, and they were aimed at older students who were often just returning to college, having been out for a while. So they started with 4 programs, and in each one, they assembled a list, not very difficult to do, of all the faculty who taught in that program. And they showed this list to each of the faculty taught in the program, and to administrators and to students. And they asked people to put a check mark, simply put a check mark, beside the names of every faculty member with whose teaching they were familiar. And then they said, now put a second check mark beside a name if and only if you feel that person is a superlative teacher. So they assembled two groups of faculty to look at. One were faculty who got mostly double checks. So most of the people who knew them thought they were superlative teachers. And the other group, for each college, was composed of people who got mainly single checks. Very few of the people who knew them thought they were superlative. I really want to emphasize that. Nobody was talking about anybody being bad. It was simply great or not great was the divide. They went to each of these people, an interviewer did, went to each of these people across the 4 schools and said the identical thing. You have been chosen for a study of excellence in teaching. We'd like you to describe several incidents where you felt exceptionally effective as a teacher, and several instances where you felt exceptionally and maddeningly frustrated as a teacher. Things were really not going well. And in each case, I want you to tell me the story of how it began, what happened first, what did you think about that, what did you do, then what happened, what did you think, what did you do, then what happened, what did you think, what did you do, until the story ends. So they did this. So they had a stack of interviews, and although the people who were the interviewees didn't know it, one stack was from star teachers, the ones who'd been widely regarded as terrific, and one was from the average faculty. They took at random, half of each group and set it aside. So now they still have half as many, but great teachers, not so great teachers. And the research team looked at the two sets of interviews and said, how do these two groups of people think differently? What kinds of thinking characterize the stars that doesn't characterize the average teachers? What kind of thinking characterizes the average teachers that's not found among the stars? And they created a set of concepts about this, and then particular kinds of things that people would say. There were indications that that kind of thinking was present. And as I recall, each construct had 3 or 4 different indicators. So they've created a code book, essentially. So it says, here's construct number 1, here are 4 indicators. And they gave this code book to another set of people who had so far not been involved with the investigation at all. They gave them the interviews that nobody had looked at so far with the labels removed, so they couldn't see who's the star and who's the control. They were all mixed up randomly. And they said, code these interviews in order to describe how the person is thinking as they were responding to this question and telling these, as I recall, 6 stories. If the code book was, the codes were correct in saying, yes, indeed, this is a great teacher, or this construct is there for someone we know to be a great teacher, that stayed in the model. If it wasn't, it was dropped. Now, the model was fairly complex, but a lot of it can be boiled down this way. There was a dramatic difference in the way that the star teachers thought about the nature of the job versus the way the average faculty thought about the nature of the job. And it would be described this way, that the stars believed that everybody in their class was capable of becoming engaged with the content and excelling if they were taught appropriately. And that it was not possible to enter a classroom on day 1 and know what to do in order to get all of them to excel. You had to figure it out. Now, you brought certain kinds of knowledge about the field and about students in previous classes with you, so you had some informed conjectures, but once you start teaching, you start trying things and you watch to see what happens. You look at assignments, you look at tests, you look at people's expressions during class, you ask them questions and see how they respond. And based on this flow of information that the instructor is getting from his or her study of the students and the study of learning in the course, you adjust what you're doing. And it's my recollection, it's been a little while since I've looked at this, that perhaps they paid a little more attention to the students who weren't yet engaged, who weren't yet excelling. What can I do to get her going? What can I do to get them going? And so on. Now, obviously, at the end of the term, you didn't necessarily have everybody engaged and everybody excelling, but that's how they thought about the enterprise of teaching a class. The average teachers tended to believe that it was inevitable that a significant number of students would do badly in the class. They were essentially fated to do badly by characteristics they had before they ever entered the course, and perhaps before they ever entered the institution. That's just the way things are. My job is to put it out there, put the content out there. It's their job to get it. So if I've organized my materials well, if I'm speaking clearly, if I've judged people objectively, perhaps if I've shown a little enthusiasm from behind the lectern or whatever, I'm a good teacher. If after that you failed the exam, sorry, but you were a bad student. And that's the way that the average faculty felt. So when I saw Ken's book, I thought, gee, here's somebody who's done not quite the same kind of methodology, but in some ways similar. I wonder if he found the same things, because he was looking at a far larger sample of institutions than Carol and her colleagues were. And I'll leave it as a little bit of a surprise for you and Ken to find out whether he was. I will tell you that if you're interested in the Schneider study, it is on the web. And if you've ever used little bitty URLs, you may know what's coming. The URL is bit.ly, bit.ly/balancing act. Balancing act, capital B, capital A, and a hyphen between them. So bit.ly/capital B balancing hyphen capital A act, and you'll be able to see the study, which will be a PDF of a typed report. And I mean typewriter, because this was 1981 that study was done. Ken Bain is a professor of history going way back. He's the author of What the Best College Teachers Do in 2004 and What the Best College Students Do in 2012, both of which won the Virginia and Warren Stone Prize for Outstanding Book on Education and Society. He has the maybe unique record of having been founding director of 4 major teaching and learning centers at different institutions. I don't think that meant that the price of founding a teaching and learning center is to be tossed out, but perhaps so. He might be able to tell us that. But these are institutions you might recognize: New York University, Northwestern, Vanderbilt, and Montclair State, where Ken was most recently until he moved to our town a few months ago and is now where he's now provost of the University of the District of Columbia. He's also a professor of history and urban education at UDC. So with that, let me introduce Ken Bain.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it immensely. Thank you for coming out this afternoon. How many of you, let me ask the question the other way, how many of you were here for Lee's talk? Okay. Someone said at the end, I'm not sure it was you, Steve, or someone else, said, well, come back this afternoon for Ken's session, it will be very different. And I thought about that for a minute, and I thought, yeah, probably will be, but I hope that wasn't a euphemism for it won't be nearly as good. So we'll trust that that wasn't the case. Well, I want to begin by asking you a question. I want you to think about something that you learned deeply because you took a deep approach to that learning. Now, I have a very specific definition in mind when I say learned deeply and you took a deep approach to that learning. That definition comes from a large and growing body of research and theoretical literature that began with a single experiment at a Swedish university in 1976. And on that particular occasion, the researchers did something that I suspect perhaps everyone in the room has done, if you've taught. That is, they gave a group of students a text and said, here, read this. When you finish, we're going to ask you some questions about it. So the students read the article, some more quickly than others, but the speed with which they read it mattered not nearly as much as something else that the researchers began to discover. And that is that different students had taken, and that's the key word here, had taken fundamentally different approaches to that text. On one end of the scale, the students had simply tried to remember as much of the text as possible. They saw their goal as being able to replicate all of the isolated pieces of information they encountered in that text. At the other end of the scale, a very different approach. Those students, the other end, tried to discern meaning lying behind the text. And that was their intention. And then to think about the implications of that meaning and the applications of that meaning and the possibilities coming out of that meaning, to begin to theorize out of that meaning. They looked for arguments in the text and distinguished in those arguments between evidence on the one hand and conclusions on the other. Theirs was a very different approach. Now, the researchers gave these two groups names. They called the first group surface learners and the second group deep learners. So that's in major part what I mean when I ask you to think about something that you learned deeply because you took a deep approach to that learning. You had deep intentions. Now here's my question. What were the conditions in your own mind and in your surroundings that led you to take that deep approach in the first place, to have those deep intentions? And I'd like to get you to think about that and to give you a minute or two to just jot down on a piece of paper or a corner of your brain, whichever is handier, some of those major conditions. Would you do that? Okay. In about a minute, I'm going to ask you to turn to one other person and share your list of conditions with them. But not quite yet. Keep thinking on your own. Come in, join us. Would you do that? Turn to one other person, and I'm going to wander around and listen in on some of these conversations.
I saw a problem, I was trying to solve a problem. This was the field.
Complexity matters too, because if it's a big concept that you can't like rote memorize something, then you have to understand it deeply in order to remember it. So you have to understand why something works rather than necessarily.
And that really sparked my interest to be able to
So what'd you think? What were those conditions?
Sort of my professor himself, actually.
Yeah, okay. Okay. That led you to take the deep approach in the first place? Okay. Excellent. Excellent. So what were those conditions?
I was writing my dissertation at the time and asking myself constantly, what distinguishes my idea from what other people have done? How am I looking at this differently, and am I looking at all sides?
So, but what was it that led you to take that kind of deep approach, to have that deep intention, to understand meaning and to think about implications and applications?
Well, I guess partly knowing that I was going to be judged by a panel of.
Need to know.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Let me see what.
So you take the time to look up supporting stuff and you read slowly?
Yeah, I know about the exchanges. I learned about the other person.
Well, I've been hearing some interesting conversations here in the center aisle. But let me bring you back together. And let's begin to have a conversation across the room. I heard you say something interesting. I'm going to start with you.
Oh, that puts the pressure on. But I have to be interesting. Well, maybe the part you heard was the genesis of me trying to dig deeper. I was trying to solve a practical problem.
Okay.
And I couldn't do that without understanding some foundations and figuring out how to get there.
Okay, so you had a problem. You had a need to know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how many of you put down something similar of a problem, a need to know, other kinds of things? Yeah. What would you add to this?
Mine was significance, that it had either a personal or professional significance to me, and I
Okay.
had to understand at a deep level what the information was.
All right, very good, very good. Excellent. What would you add to this, sir?
Oh, I thought that I had excitement about a topic.
Excitement,
and like he added
enthusiasm.
passion.
Yeah. How many of you had something like excitement, enthusiasm, fascination, or something of that sort? Anything else?
I had time.
Time.
Time to really spend with
Yeah.
material. I know,
Yeah.
I picked the wrong audience.
Yeah.
We don't have that at all, but
Right.
yes, at that point in my life, I did.
Yeah, of course, you had time to do it. So you had enthusiasm, you had fascination, you had interest. Now, as it turns out, there is a large and, in fact, growing body of research about why people take deep approaches to their learning. Now, much of that research has been done in Northern Europe, in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand, in Hong Kong, and a few other places around the earth. About maybe 15-20% of it has been done in the United States, but enough of it to suggest it applies to our students as well. Now, if I were to take that body of research and what I'm hearing from you here this afternoon, here's the way I would summarize it. See if this works. That people are most likely to take a deep approach to their learning. To take a deep approach to their learning. Have those deep intentions when they are trying to solve problems or answer questions that they, the learner, have come to regard as important, intriguing, or in some cases, just beautiful. Does that work for you? Well, we have a lot of evidence that that's when students are most likely to take that deep approach to their learning. But here's the problem. While we have that evidence, in a formal educational environment, the learner is usually not in charge of the questions. So we have a gap. We have a gap between those conditions which your experience and the research suggest are going to be most conducive to getting people to take that deep approach and the conditions inherent within a formal educational environment. Now, I can make a very good case, and I'm sure you can too, that it is rightfully so that you are in charge of the questions. You know more. You can imagine questions that the novice learner cannot. And part of our responsibility is to bring that novice learner to the questions that we understand more deeply. But that creates a gap. And how we fill that gap becomes extraordinarily important. And part of what we were doing in this study is looking for people who had phenomenal success in filling that gap. But I want to come back to that question because I have another question for you. This question is, why is it the case that so many of our students will never predominantly take a deep approach to their learning? Why is it the case that so many of our students will in fact predominantly throughout their studies take a surface approach to their learning, or a third approach that began appearing in the literature by the 1980s, often called a strategic approach to learning? You chuckle because you recognize the strategic learner. So we have three types. We have the surface learner. Research says the surface learner is usually driven by a sense of fear. You know? You ever had a student who says, if I can only get out of this course alive? That's the surface learner. And what surface learners usually do is their weapon of choice is to try to memorize everything. Memorize the steps in solving a problem. Memorize procedures, memorize forms, memorize whatever. Memorize names, dates, whatever. They see that as the easiest approach to their problem because they're simply trying to survive, keep themselves above water. Turns out to be one of the most difficult, if not impossible, tasks. If you don't understand, how in the world do you ever remember? And then we have the strategic learner. The strategic learner is often driven by a desire for recognition, usually in the form of grades. They pursue those grades relentlessly. That's their goal. That's their intention, to make high grades, and they often do make high grades. Appear on the dean's list. Graduate with honors. Has a certain cachet to it. But we all know it has limitations. People who are predominantly strategic in their approach to learning tend not to become risk takers. They tend not to become those people who will go off exploring their own curiosity. In fact, they repress their curiosity in order to focus only on those things that will serve their interests. They don't want to take new things because that might jeopardize their grade point average. They don't want to explore new fields. They're not quite sure how they might do in those fields. So they become very strategic, and they do not become explorers. Furthermore, the research suggests to us that people who predominantly take a strategic approach to their learning will tend to learn procedurally and not conceptually. They will learn how to follow the procedures. Steps in solving a problem, steps in writing an essay. But they don't learn conceptually. And we'll see that in just a little bit later on in quite dramatic detail. But because they do not tend to learn conceptually, they also tend not to become what the literature calls adaptive experts. They may, in fact, become routine experts, but not adaptive ones. Now, this distinction between routine experts on the one hand and adaptive experts on the other is extraordinarily important, so let's stop and think about it for a moment. It was first suggested by some Japanese theorists back in the 1980s. And the distinction they made was this: a routine expert knows all the routines of his or her field. They can do those routines in their sleep. And they might, in fact, be able to do those routines, those known ways of solving problems, of addressing issues, so well that they might even be considered world class in their abilities. But the adaptive expert in this conceptualization has something else. They also know the common routines, the standard routines, but they have something else, and that something else is both an ability and an attitude. It is the ability and the attitude both to recognize and to relish the opportunity and the necessity for invention. They are people who can take on those unusual problems, and they're not afraid of them. And they're quite good at taking on problems that nobody's ever encountered before, and therefore there is no set routine on them. Now, as it turns out, I would argue our society needs lots of adaptive experts. Whether it's to deal with a sagging economy, or to plug a hole in the Gulf of Mexico, or to deal with conflicts around the world, or at home, we need adaptive experts. And routine experts, students who take that strategic approach to their learning, do not tend to become adaptive experts. So the question I raise here has some special significance. And that question again is, why is it that so many of our students will take a strategic or surface approach to their learning predominantly? Well, they may occasionally go off on a deep approach, but not predominantly. That is the case. Why is it? Now, there's been a considerable body of research around that question, and it would be presumptuous of me to attempt to try to summarize that research for you this afternoon. But I'm going to attempt to do so. And actually, in a single word. You see, it's not genetic. It's not personality. It's not whatever we might define as intelligence and however we might measure that intelligence. Those are not the major factors. The major factor is conditioning. People are conditioned to become strategic or surface learners rather than deep learners. Now, that conditioning occurs in a lot of places. But guess where much of it takes place? In school. In short, it's what we do to our students. Well, not us, of course. It's all those other teachers, right? What they are doing to the students. Now, here's what I want to get you to do. You may or may not be familiar with this body of research literature. Most likely you're not, because it's not well known in the United States. But you've been to school. You're involved in schooling, in education. So here's what I'd like to get you to do. I'd like to get you to think about what it is about schooling that might foster a surface or strategic approach to learning rather than a deep approach. And this room is not terribly conducive to do this, but I think we can do this in groups of 2 or 3. You can turn around and talk to those people, for example. You might get this guy to come over and talk to you here. But I'd like for you to just speculate for a few minutes about what are those conditions in schooling that might foster the strategic or surface approach to learning. Yes, I know there are things that happen outside of school, but we don't have control over those. So I want to concentrate on those things over which we do have control. So I want you to think about what happens in school on any level. So have fun. And again, I'm going to wander around and listen in, and I'm going to pick a different aisle to do the wandering in. I must say that there may be some people in the room who by this point are just terribly disappointed. You're going to be terribly disappointed if you expected a very simple list of do's and don'ts on how to be a great teacher. Cultivating someone else's learning is not that easy. It requires very deep thought. And so what I want to do is to engage you in that deep thought. Now, what's the deep thought you've been having, Daniel, about what are those conditions that are be most conducive in schooling to surface or strategic approaches to learning?
A lot of people in the classroom and multiple choice tests at the end.
Okay, multiple choice question at the end. All right. So how many of you had something about assessment or testing? Yeah. That's one of the major findings of the research, is that the form of assessment that students face will define their expectations. A student who faces, a steady diet for years of multiple choice examinations that merely require them to regurgitate isolated pieces of information, they're going to assume that learning is being able to regurgitate isolated pieces of information. Now, Eric Masur, in fact, uses multiple choice questions in much different kind of ways, and maybe if we have time, we'll explore that. But the way they often appear is just that. It just, all I got to do is be able to recognize the right answer on the examination. So that's conducive. So other factors here. Julie.
That was most of what we talked about. We
Okay.
talked about memorization needs and how much you're teaching the bigger picture versus details.
Okay, all right, very good. Now, there are some theorists who believe that the mere existence of grades may in fact contribute to this process. Yeah. So how long have grades been around? You use ABCs here, that sort of thing? So how long has that been around? Anybody familiar with the history? As it turns out, not very long. It's largely a product of the Industrial Revolution. When society began with the coming of the Industrial Revolution to say to educators, you have a new responsibility. The old ones to educate the young. The new ones not only educate the young, but to certify how much learning has taken place. So that was added on. Now, we've lived with it all of our lives, so we often have difficulty in stepping back and realizing it was added on to the basic process of helping people to learn. So we invented grades. As far as we know, ABC system first used at Oxford and Cambridge, late 18th century, not widely used on either side of the Atlantic until the late 19th century. First major public school system to use it, I believe, was St. Louis, beginning in 1881. That recently, So by the 20th century, it becomes ubiquitous. And as my neighbor in Montclair, Yogi Berra, says, it also became everywhere. So we have this system now of grades, but what is it about grades and the existence of grades that might be conducive to surface and strategic approaches rather than deep ones?
What do I need to do to get an A?
Yeah, okay.
And I'm only going to, I'm going to.
Yeah, but why does that happen? I mean, why can't you also be interested in the subject matter and get the good grade?
Well, because so much of what they do in the future, at least in my profession, is tied to grades.
Okay.
So they can't really go on if their grades aren't good.
Okay, all right. Other thoughts on this?
Well, when we went to school, there was the concept of the gentleman's bee. You didn't have to outdo your neighbor.
Okay.
And it was considered poor form.
Yeah.
But you were there mainly for learning. But from grammar school, first day you walked in, you were starting to do the addition tables, subtraction tables, time tables, and you were asked to stand up and perform in front of this crowd of your peers. If you couldn't do it, that was an embarrassment to you.
Yeah, okay. How many of you are familiar with some of the research on extrinsic and intrinsic motivators? That becomes very important in this discussion. One of the pioneers was a man by the name of Edward Deci, D-E-C-I. And long ago and far away, Deci came up with this thought problem I want us to think about. It goes something like this. He says, imagine that somebody has a very deep interest in doing something, an intrinsic interest in doing something. His example was mowing a lawn. I actually cannot imagine that. But let's say they have a deep intrinsic interest in learning, what do you teach?
History.
History, in learning history. There you go. And then in his thought problem, he says, what would happen if somebody else comes along and offers you a reward or punishment to get you to keep on doing what you otherwise like to do, and then that reward or punishment is withdrawn? What would happen to the level of the original intrinsic interest? That was his research question. Would it go up because it had this boost from the extrinsic? The compelling thought of the day coming out of B.F. Skinner and behavioralism was, yes, it will go up. Feed the rat more carrots or whatever else as a reward, and the interest will go up. That was the notion of behavioralism and B.F. Skinner. But DC had his doubts, so he set up this elaborate experiment, much replicated, in which he and others concluded that in fact it doesn't go up, it doesn't stay the same, it tends in fact to go down. And it goes down, as one of DC's colleagues put it, especially when the subject feels a loss of the locus of control. Now, I love the way you psychologists talk. I would put it a little bit differently. It goes down when people feel manipulated by someone else, when they feel like they are not in control of their own lives. Now, if you think about DC's thought problem, I don't think you could come up with a better real-life example than schooling. You been around a 4 or 5-year-old lately? I have 2 young grandsons, 8 and 5. I'm about to acquire a new one who's now about 1.5 years. My daughter's adopting. Not a miracle of science, but just adoption. But the 2 I know now, 8 and 5, they're just full of questions. You know, they just drive you crazy with their questions. Often take that same kid, age 18, nothing. I remember my niece, who's now, oh Lord, she's 48 years old. But when she was about 5 years old, she and I took an automobile trip from Austin to San Antonio, Texas. I was driving. And in that 78 miles down I-35, that little girl asked me, I think at least 7,800 questions. And nearly every single one of them was about astronomy. Now, she didn't know the word astronomy from Adam. Adam's my grandson. But she had asked me things like, where's the sun at night? Where are the stars during the day? Why is there a sunset? And I'm trying to maneuver down the highway, get between the trucks, you know. So I start getting sarcastic with her, you know, saying things like, oh, there's no such thing as a sunset. It's an earth roll. Well, think about it. It is an earth roll, isn't it, right? But no matter how sarcastic I got, she'd come back with another question. So fast forward about 15 years. I see her a few times in that period, but not a lot. So she's about 20 years old. She's a junior at Clemson. I go up to her at a family reunion, and I say to her, Andra, what are you going to take next semester? And I still remember her reaction. You know, her body began to sink. And finally she said, a bunch of required stuff. And I said, oh, like what? She said, got to take some science requirements. And I said, oh, what'd you decide to take? She said, I signed up for an astronomy class. I said, oh, I know you're very interested in astronomy. And she looked at me like I was completely crazy. You know, something tragic had happened to her. She'd gone to school. In the process of which she had lost all of that childhood curiosity. Now, there's a happy end to this story. A few years ago, she came through my home in New Jersey with her 2 sons and husband on her way to Boston, and she stopped over, and I confessed to her that I was going around the world telling stories about her. And she looked at me and she said, "Do you know what I do for a living today?" And I said, "No, as a matter of fact, I don't. I'm sorry." "I teach astronomy," she said proudly. So there was something in that course, you see. So when you look out at your students, realize that in each one of them, there's a 5-year-old inside there. And part of the trick is finding that 5-year-old and reviving their interest. But the research suggests to us that the grades and the extrinsic rewards and punishments that we drape before them and drape over them actually couldn't be better designed to kill that curiosity. So it's a problem. And how we deal with that problem is extremely important. All of our subjects taught in the era of grades. We couldn't figure out how to interview somebody from the 15th century. So every one of them was in the era of grades. But how they dealt with that became extraordinarily important, because you have to realize it's one of the forces that you're dealing with in trying to cultivate that deep approach to learning. What else? What other major problems you think might keep people from taking a deep approach that we've not addressed thus far?
So I think it's that we ask people to tell us answers, and we evaluate them on answers as opposed to asking them to tell us questions.
Yeah, or how they got to those answers.
Well, no, I'm not even there. We don't help them develop
Their
questions.
own questions. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yes, sir.
Or that the learning is going to take place over the next 2 hours while we're in the classroom.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than thinking of the classroom as a place that might stimulate the learning that's going to take place over the next week. Yes, sir.
I don't think we always make our goals and objectives very clear to our learners. I'll give a quick
Say more,
example. When
please.
I was a first-year medical student, I took a biochemistry course, and there was a lot of information to be learned. And I thought the approach should be to memorize that information.
Yeah.
The instructor was not a physician and didn't make a contextual connection for me, or as you said earlier, this meaningful learning to, if I learned the Krebs cycle, which occurs within a cell, I would know something about diabetes and about people with glucose problems and so forth. So I just learned the information very superficially, even though I would have liked to have learned differently.
Yeah.
I was worried about the test.
Yeah. And the test becomes extraordinarily important. Somebody mentioned earlier time. We often don't give students enough time to learn deeply. We emphasize covering a body of material rather than uncovering it, for example. But that notion of just emphasizing covering material rather than an emphasis upon learning. I was struck by the Provost's comments this morning in thinking about his own class and thinking about it in terms of, well, how much do students learn versus how much I cover within the course? And that becomes an extraordinarily important question. But we often don't ask that question, so we don't give people enough time to deal with it. So there are a lot of factors that can play into this problem. Now, I'd like for you to think about, though, a third question. And I must warn you, this one becomes even more complex. But I want you to recognize that thus far, we've been thinking about really 2 different scales, but kind of mixing them up. On the one hand, we've had a scale of intentions. What are your intentions? Are they surface? Are they strategic? Are they deep? That's one scale. On the other hand, there's a scale of accomplishment. Do I achieve a surface understanding? Do I achieve a deep understanding? But the two scales are related, because the research suggests that if a student does not have deep intentions to learn, it is highly unlikely that they will achieve a deep result. Possible, but highly unlikely. Sometimes we look at our students and we say, I don't understand why they didn't get it. They didn't get it because they didn't intend to get it. They intended to make good grades. That's different than getting it. They intended to survive the course. That's different than getting it.
It's a question. I hope you can insert this in the analysis. Two kind of things you could study, like banjo or a foreign language. Let's say you're an adult, you've got a job, and you really want to learn how to speak French or how to play the banjo. You find somebody, you pay him to teach you. Now, in those circumstances, you go see the resource person once or twice a week, but you're doing a lot of work on your own, and do you care about a grade or a certificate? No. You want to learn how to speak French or how to play the banjo.
Yeah,
That's my question.
That becomes the intention. Now, these two scales, intentions on the one hand and results on the other, as I say, are related. But here's the problem. Merely because a student develops deep intentions does not necessarily mean that they will achieve deep results. And in fact, I'm going to argue this afternoon that it is extraordinarily difficult for human beings to achieve a deep understanding of anything completely new. And that we must understand this difficulty if we are going to create better learning environments. Now, to make my argument, I want to carry you back to the very beginning of your learning. Now, I mean to the very beginning. Where did your learning begin and when did it begin? You're lying there in the crib. It's a newborn. So let's think about how it begins. You're a newborn, you're lying there in the crib, strange world, and you're being bombarded by all this sensory input. It's your only contact with the outside world. Otherwise, you're just that brain up there in the dark. So you get all this sensory input. You don't have a dictionary in your diaper you can whip out and look it up, say, oh, this means that. So what do? You try to make sense of it. But how do you make sense of it? You make sense of it by doing something that the brain, the human brain, does extraordinarily well. You notice patterns. And as you notice patterns, you begin to build in your own mind little schemas, little schematas of how the world works, mental models, paradigms of how the world works. And at first, those paradigms are pretty simple. I cry, I get fed. I cry, I get my diaper changed. That's it. That's how the world works. But as time goes on, those models become more and more complex. But you not only build those models, you begin to use those models to understand new sensory input. And you've been doing that for your entire life. So, for example, anybody besides me who had never been in this room prior to today? Okay, so you'd never been here. But when you walked through that door, you got some sensory input. Electromagnetic field we call light tickled the retina of your eye. Now, how did you understand this room? Just in terms of that electromagnetic field? No. You understood this room in terms of models that you had built years ago. So you looked at this and you understood this as a chair, as something you could sit down on. You understood this as an aisle. You understood this as an aisle. So you understood this room in terms of models that you had built years ago. Imagine this. He had never been here in his entire life. He walks in the door and he knows exactly what to do. And he knows how this room works. You think about that, that's pretty amazing. Now, that ability, that habit of understanding a completely new situation in terms of some previously existing model serves us extremely well on a day-to-day basis. It enables us to work in a place we've never been before. But that ability, that habit, also proves to be one of our greatest challenges as learners and as educators. And it proves to be such a huge challenge because we often want our students to build completely new models of reality, or at minimum, to be able to question their existing models. I come from the humanities. I'm a historian. We often say in the humanities that the mark of an educated person is a person who realizes the problems they face in believing whatever they may believe. Now, my friends in the sciences will often go a little bit further, and they'll say, no, I actually want my students to abandon this model of reality and move to this one. We wouldn't say that so much in the humanities. But either way, in the sciences or in the humanities, whichever epistemology we're using, we in essence are asking our students to do something that might even be considered unnatural. Now, the problem to which I refer here is, I think, well illustrated by a story that I tell at the beginning of the second chapter of this book, What the Best College Teachers Do. Have any of you read that book, by the way? Oh my, okay. Okay. Did any of you who raised your hand suffer from insomnia? That's the reason you read it? No, okay, we'll assume not. All right, so in the beginning of the second chapter, I tell this little story, and if you don't mind, I'll repeat it here. You know it already. It's about two physicists. Who teaches physics? Okay, all right, okay. You probably know this story, even if you haven't read the book. About two physicists at Arizona State who some years ago asked this question: does my introductory physics class change the way students think about and understand motion? Now, you can substitute anything you want to. Does my course change the way students think about and understand? You fill in the blank. In the case of physics, introductory course, presumably they'd change their concept of motion. If they don't, then there's one of two conditions. Either one, they don't need to take the course, or at least that section of the course, because they're already there. Or two, the course failed them, or they failed the course. So this was an important question to ask in physics. And to find the answer, these two physicists devised an instrument to measure concepts of motion. And they gave that instrument, it's called the Force Concept Inventory, still widely used in physics, right? Okay, so they gave that instrument to about 600 students coming into an introductory physics class right prior to the fall semester. Find out how they conceive of motion coming in. And basically what they discovered was that most of them conceived of motion pretty much the way Aristotle conceived of motion. That's not a nonsensical way of thinking about motion, an Aristotelian notion, but it's not the way modern physics has thought about motion since Newton, let alone Feynman. It's not the way he thinks about motion. But okay, that's before they took the course. They're Aristotelian in their thinking without going into the details of what that means. I'll let him explain that later. So they then took the course. Some made A's, some made B's, C's, so on and so forth. And then, some weeks after the course was over, they brought the students back and they gave them exactly the same instrument all over again to see how much change had taken place. Guess what? For the overwhelming majority of those students, the change was virtually none. But it gets worse. They also discovered that the degree of change was not predictable by the grades that they made. So that the A students and the C students were just as likely or just as unlikely to have changed their basic concept of motion. Now, how can that be? How can someone make an A in a modern physics class and continue to conceive of motion in Aristotelian rather than Newtonian terms? It can be because of the way the human brain works. Those students brought with them their Aristotelian model of motion. They then took all of the sensory input they received, the lectures they heard, the textbooks they read, the lab work they did. We can think of all of that just sensory input. They took all of that sensory input and they simply wrapped it around their pre-existing model, and that model did not change. And the difference between the A students and the C students, you know already. The A students were strategic learners. They had learned procedurally to memorize the right formula and to use that formula to get the right answer on the examination. But in terms of any conceptual understanding, they were no better off than the students who had made C's and D's. Now, my friend Eric Masur, who teaches physics at Harvard, read that study several years ago, and he was at first horrified. And then he said to himself, that was at Arizona State. I teach at Harvard. So one day he decided, as he tells the story, on sort of a lark, to give his students the force concept inventory. He said, we deal with that the first few weeks. They'll ace it. They did worse than the students at Arizona State. And it was a big wake-up call to Eric, and he decided to change his teaching dramatically. But the point I'm trying to make to you is that learning deeply something completely new is inherently difficult because of the way the human brain works. And we have to realize that difficulty if we want to overcome it. Now, one of our research questions was, in this study, was how do people overcome this? So we were looking for people who were extraordinarily good at helping students to not only take, but actually achieve a deep conceptual understanding of something completely new. That was one of our criteria. And as we looked at those people, we wanted to know how they did it. Because after all, it happens, right? When I first started out, I asked you to think about something that you learned deeply. I don't remember any of you raising your hand and saying, I never learned deeply. So it happens. So what are the circumstances under which it does happen? So we asked people. We not only asked them, we watched them. We sat in on their classes. We took their classes. We videotaped their classes. We studied those videotapes. We looked at lecture notes. We looked at other materials that they produced. And out of all of that text began to draw some conclusions. And here's what we heard them saying. You have to create an environment where deep learning is likely to take place. Okay, that's pretty general. Create an environment. But there's nothing here about lectures, discussion sections, problem-based learning, or anything else. It's just an environment. Okay? But what's the nature of that environment? And as we began to tease out the nature of the environments that we were seeing and hearing about and experiencing in these different classes, regardless of discipline, regardless of the type of institutions, I was located at Vanderbilt and at Northwestern during most of this 15-year study. But I looked at open admission schools, community colleges, regional state universities, liberal arts institutions, a wide variety of different kinds of institutions. As we began to tease out the environment, we began to hear common elements regardless of discipline, regardless of the nature of the school, regardless of the nature of the students, regardless of the admission standards of that particular school. And it was so common that we gave that environment a name. We called it a natural critical learning environment. And in the years since, we've teased out about 15 different elements to that natural critical learning environment. But I'd like for us to think about and work with a couple really central aspects of that environment. And they are these. That one, you must first put the learner in a situation in which their existing mental models do not work. We came to call this an expectation failure, because that describes what happens. The brain comes to expect one thing, and you don't get it. And you have to stop and go, whoa, what was that? I got to rethink this. That's not what I expected at all. So that's the first ingredient. But there's a second ingredient. The first one by itself, necessary, but not quite sufficient. The second one is that the learner must care that their mental model does not exist. And he laughs because he realizes that's the catch. How do you get people to care? And caring, as it turns out, becomes central to the whole process of creating that natural critical learning environment. Coupled with, not just getting them to care, not just caring about anything, but caring that their existing models do not work and that they're challenged. Now, another name for the expectation failure, an old-fashioned name called an intellectual challenge. So we present students with intellectual challenges. We challenge their ways of thinking. And through those challenges, get them to think differently or to question and to realize the problems they face in believing whatever they may believe. But merely telling students the truth often doesn't do it. Those physics students were, quote, told the truth, unquote, in various ways, in lectures, in labs, in textbooks. Didn't work. So here's the challenge I want to give you. I want you, one, to think about a course that you teach and to think about what are some of the major paradigms, mental models, that students are likely to bring to that course that you will want them at minimum to question and perhaps to change. And then secondly, how can you create an expectation failure for them about which they will care? Now, you may never have thought about your students and your teaching this way, but I guarantee you it will be extraordinarily fruitful to engage in this conversation with yourself and perhaps with your colleagues. So I want to give you some time to think about that and to explore your own course and to think about what are the mental models, what are the paradigms that they're likely to bring, and how can I create that expectation failure for them about which they will care. So how much time you need? About 7 years? Yeah, whole semester? Yeah. Okay, Steve, I'll be back in 7 years. Well, we don't have that much time this afternoon, but how about 7 minutes? And just begin to think about it. And you can talk to yourself, you can talk to your colleague, you can get up and run around the room, you can take over the camera, you can, whatever works for you. But just think about this problem and think about what are some paradigms that students are likely to bring to your course, central paradigms that will make a huge difference in whether or not they are able to move on with the course. And then secondly, how can you create an expectation failure for them about which they care, keeping in mind that just, quote, telling them the truth, unquote, will not work, most likely. They have to discover that this is really not a chair and it's some huge, big blue cake or some such thing. They have to discover that. Their expectation failure has to be so compelling. Okay, so have at it. Talk to yourself, talk to each other, and I'm going to wander around, listen in on these conversations, watch your brain work, and we'll see what happens. So what are you coming up with? I didn't give you enough time to really struggle with this, but I hope this stimulates an ongoing conversation, because this conversation has to continue for you really to begin to struggle with this issue. Now, caring turns out to be extraordinarily important, and I think is well illustrated by what happens in the rest of the physics story. Let me share that with you just very briefly. Halone and Hestenes were so disturbed by their initial results that their first conclusion was, it must be our instrument. Can't be that bad. So they decided to interview some of these students. So they brought them in, about 60 of them, and they sat down with them one-on-one. And on those one-on-one sessions, one of the things they did was a little demonstration in which they said to the student, look, we have a ball on the end of a string, and we're going to cause that ball to go around in a big circle tethered only by that string. And at point A, we're going to let go of the string, and we want you to predict the direction that the ball will take. Okay? So these students had all had physics. Let's say that their predictions did not conform to physical reality. Or another way of putting it, they were wrong. But they were basing their predictions, you see, on their Aristotelian concept of motion. You know the most frequent prediction they made? Yeah, exactly. That it would continue going off like this. You know, violates everything. But that was their conception. They then did the demonstration in front of them, giving them an expectation failure. And they thought at that point that the students would go, ah, of course, now I get it. But they didn't. Instead, many of the students began to argue with the experimenters and to engage in all sorts of mental gymnastics to keep from confronting the reality that their mental model did not work. Now, two things were going on there, I would suspect. One is they didn't care enough to really stop and grapple and rebuild their model. And then secondly, giving up their existing model, even their existing model about how moving bodies work, was emotionally painful to them. People don't like to give up their existing models. You know, we hold on to them. And so the third ingredient in this natural critical learning environment is that sometimes we have to help students deal with the emotional trauma of confronting a challenge to some deeply held paradigm. I face that in teaching American history. My students often come in with almost religious convictions about what they think happened in the past in this country, and to confront evidence that suggests that, well, maybe it was a little bit fuzzier than you think. It just, I mean, it's more than they can take. Yes, sir.
May I ask you if these physics students were physics majors or science majors or non-science majors?
Yeah, many of them were physics majors, but not all of them. And in fact, the research replicated has found that students even 2 or 3 courses deep into a physics curriculum will often have many of the same difficulties. But it's just reflective of the way the human brain works, because the human brain wants to hold on to its existing model. It's not just in physics, it's in history as well, because we're all dealing with human beings, at least last time I checked. So in history, one of the best books on learning how to think historically, the very title of the book captures the point here. It's by Samuel Weinberg. And the title of the book is Historical Thinking and Other Unnatural Acts. Because you think about historical thinking in these terms, it's an unnatural act. What do we want students to do when we ask them to think historically? We want them to understand the past on the basis of evidence derived from the past. And what do they want to do? They want to try to understand the past on the basis of what they think they understand about the present, right? Presentism, as it's called in the field. So they take their current models and they'll try to wrap it around 5th century Greece, 19th century America, 18th century France, or whatever else the case may be. So it's very difficult to break out of the paradigms that you currently have.
When the students argue
Yeah.
You see, because there they are presented with something that they weren't going to experience.
Right.
So when they argued, was it, I don't understand and I want to know why?
Yeah, and sometimes they are struggling with that. Yeah, sometimes they are struggling with that, but sometimes it's too difficult. Or sometimes they just don't care enough to really struggle with it, so they just give up and say, all right, I just want the A, or I want the C, or I want whatever the case may be. And getting them to care becomes extraordinarily important. So what are the paradigms that you've identified? Anybody have some good ones? Anybody have some bad ones? Yeah, Steve.
Actually, this is just a reminder, it's being videoed, so if people don't have the microphone, they won't be heard.
Ah, yes, so I'll make sure that I get a microphone in their head. Okay, so we got another person wandering around with a microphone. Okay, so yeah, what's the paradigm here?
So I teach sonography, which is an imaging science.
Yeah, so what's the
And
paradigm they have?
I'm not sure I'm coming up with it as a paradigm, but as a way of understanding space. You know, so they
Yeah.
have to understand an image. They see a two-dimensional image on the screen and they have to recreate it in a 3D thing inside their head, and they're just so
Okay.
confused.
Okay, all right, okay. Anybody got another one? Paradigm? Yes, it's way over there, and I'll try to run over there as rapidly as possible. Make sure that you get on tape on this. Will you hand this back to this lady right behind you?
I was interested with the physics problem, if you could turn it around and say what conditions would be necessary for
Yeah, you
the
could.
ball
You could, but what do you
to
teach?
achieve.
What do
I
you-
teach writing and women's
Okay,
studies.
so what's some paradigms that students are likely to have in writing our women's studies? Yes.
So one is that there are two sides to everything, and both sides deserve equal time.
Okay, all right, okay. All right. I've had this discussion with about 40,000 faculty members over the last 10 years or so. And I've noticed that there are really three different kinds of paradigms, and we'll just see how many of you have one in one of these categories and see if there's a fourth category. But the three I've identified thus far are paradigms they have about themselves. In math, I can't do math. I'm not a math person. In writing, I can't write. I'm not a writing person. So paradigms they have about themselves can be extraordinarily important. Then second are paradigms they have about the nature of education. You know, about what it means to learn and how best to learn. Why are you asking me to talk to my neighbor? Just give me the facts, I'll memorize them, I want to prepare for the examination. That's their paradigm about learning and about how education should be conducted. And then there are paradigms within the discipline, which can range all over the place. Anybody got one besides those three? Most of them fit in those three, I think. Now here's the other question. How do you get people to care? How do you get people to care?
I'm going to make a bad joke, but being French, I tell them that a French scientist discovered that, and that usually works.
Okay, all right. How do you get people to care?
Well, use their conditioning somehow related to the grading.
Okay, all right. How do you get people to care in your class?
Sometimes you just don't.
Sometimes you just don't, she says. But let's think about this for a minute. How do you get people to care? Let's go back to the summary that I made at the top of our discussion. I said that people are most likely to take a deep approach when they are trying to answer questions or solve problems that they, the learner, have come to regard as important, intriguing, or just beautiful. And that the problem was often that the learner wasn't in charge of the questions. Now, what we observed among our really outstanding teachers was the ability, a foundational ability, to raise fascinating questions. That often meant beginning with questions that were already on the minds of the students. Or sometimes it meant raising a question in a brand new way that the students would find fascinating, interesting, and even fun. Can I give you a couple of illustrations of what I'm talking about? The first illustration isn't in the book because we didn't discover this young woman until long after the book was published. Her name is Melissa Harris Perry. Some of you may know her from MSNBC. Well, she's a student of U.S. politics, a PhD in politics, teaches now at Tulane. When this story took place, she was teaching at Princeton. In the fall of 2006, she had a question. Her question that fall, 2006, was, what kind of influence did that period we call Reconstruction, right after the American Civil War, basically a 12-year period usually characterized as a 12-year period running from 65 to 77. Her question was, what kind of influence did that period have on subsequent political developments and institutions in this country, especially for African Americans? That was her question. Now, can you imagine going into a typical undergraduate class and finding, let's say, anybody who just would be dying to find out the answer to that question? Maybe, but not very many. So she didn't ask that question. Instead, she asked another question that she knew was already on the minds of her students. And she knew it was on the minds of her students that fall of 2006 because she knew it was on the minds of most Americans that fall, and she knew that because she's also a pollster. And in fact, she argues that this question became the most influential question in the national elections of 2006 and 2008 and helped determine their national outcome. You know the question? It's a question that began to emerge on our minds on a dark night of August 28th, 2005. You know the question?
Can an African American be elected?
No, it wasn't that.
Why is the South Republican?
No, not very many people were just dying to find out the answer to that. It was basically the question of what in the world happened with Katrina, and are any of us safe? We were all asking that question. How did this disaster happen? Katrina wasn't the biggest hurricane to ever stalk the Gulf waters. That was Allen in 1980, and I lived through Allen. And Allen uprooted some trees and overturned some cows and I think invented cow tipping. But it didn't wipe out an American city. But here was Katrina, a smaller storm, and it wiped out a major American city. And we were asking ourselves, how did that disaster happen? And I think behind our question was the question, are any of us safe? And can we expect any help if we get into this kind of trouble? So she created a course entitled Disaster, Katrina, and American Politics. And she invited her students into the course with the implied question of what causes a disaster, what caused that disaster. And the class filled just like that. She set the cap finally at 80 students, but it filled just almost immediately. Students came into the course and she began the discussion. The first question she asked in the discussion was, when did the disaster begin? Did it begin on that dark night of August 28th, 2005, or did it in fact begin in 1866 with the beginning of Reconstruction in the Crescent City? And with that question, she had transformed their interest into her interest. And for her students, it was a transformative moment. I talked to many of those students, and they said things like, "This course changed my life." And at the end of the course, the students did something that Melissa never anticipated, she told me. They came to her and they said, "Professor, we all need to go to New Orleans to address the issues on the ground and to understand them more deeply. And we want you to go with us. We're going to take up a collection." And so she does. And she eventually moves to New Orleans, of course. And she says their deepest learning occurred once they arrived in New Orleans. Why? Because they brought with them a certain paradigm, and that paradigm was challenged. They faced an expectation failure. What was their paradigm? Their paradigm was, I'm a bright undergraduate college student. Once I arrive in New Orleans and walk down the streets, the problems will just sort of disappear in the wake of my coming. I exaggerate, but you get the idea. And she says, it was a humbling experience to realize how complex the problems were on the ground. So it did change students' lives. It was a transformative moment. They learned deeply. They took a deep interest, and they did so because of a question. And it all began with a question. And it's finding that question that turns out to be so significant. Let me give you a second illustration. Donald Sorry. Any of you know Don? Yeah, okay. Mathematician, member of the National Academy of Science, distinguished mathematician, also one of the best calculus teachers you'll ever encounter. His students will annually gobble up most on the A's on the departmental final, over which he has no control. They're more likely to go to graduate school. Lots of reasons to believe that they're more likely to learn conceptually. So how does he do it? It all begins with a question. And I want you to follow the process here, what he does. Goes into class the first day. This is the first day. They don't know calculus. And he has two items. One is a roll of toilet paper. The other is a big paper cutout. So he first holds up the big paper cutout. And with a great sense of fun, and I think that's a key ingredient, a great sense of fun. Don is a big guy from Michigan, and he just has a weird sense of humor. His name is Sorry, and he loves to come up to people, stick out his hand and say, "I'm sorry." So he's that kind of guy, you know. So he holds up this big paper cutout. He looks at them, he looks at the paper cutout as if it's a big Sudoku puzzle or something, and says, "This is the area under the curve. Now, how can we calculate what that area is?" First day of class. And he's asking them, get this is very important because it's a pattern we saw repeatedly. He's asking them to do the discipline before they even know the discipline. So he's asking them, in essence, to invent calculus. And he told me that his secret desire is that by the end of the course, that the students would feel a little frustrated that they had not been born prior to Newton. Otherwise, they would have invented it. Yeah. So he plays with them. Takes out a pair of scissors, cuts off a strip, holds the strip up, says, "Okay, we got that much. That's part of the area. Let's just think about how we'd figure out that much of the area." Still no response. Well, it's almost like a rectangle, except for that curved area at the top. If it were a rectangle, how would you calculate the area? Somebody finally says height times width. Okay, let's start with that. How about this curved area, though? How are you going to deal with that? And he continues to play with them this way, getting them to invent calculus. And as he says, use their own critical thinking abilities, and then he'll occasionally add the muscle of his discipline. He doesn't expect them to invent 300 years of calculus thought, but to get them to construct their own understanding. Now, here's a key element to this. When I looked at him and I first saw him do this in a class of about 200, by the way, I said, Don, that's going to take you forever and a day. He said, yeah, you're probably right. Usually after 2 weeks, I'm usually, let's say, a week and a half behind the other sections. But after 10 weeks, I'm usually a week ahead. Now think about what's involved in that kind of approach. It's not the usual approach. He doesn't just take the textbook and say, got 15 chapters, got 15 weeks, chapter a week. No. Instead, he says something else extraordinarily important I'd like to get all of you to raise in your own mind. He says, what are the 3 or maybe 4 threshold concepts that students must master if they want to enter this discipline? And they're called threshold concepts because it's the threshold into the discipline. What are the 3 or 4, 2 or 3 threshold concepts that they must construct in their own mind? And how can I get them to construct them? And if it takes more time to help them construct them, then we'll take it. And it's sort of like those buildings. I live right outside of New York City and down on Connecticut Avenue or up on Connecticut Avenue. And in New York, they build a lot of tall buildings. They don't in Washington, but they do in New York. And it seems like it takes them forever and a day to get out of the basement. But once they do, once they lay that foundation, that building springs up like Jack and the Beanstalk. You know, I can see as I drive down I-78 now, that building that's springing up at ground zero. And it just seemed like it just, you know, all of a sudden it was there and then, whoop, up in the air. But they're just laying the foundation for several years. Now, it's not going to take you for several years, but maybe in a series of courses, I don't know. But helping them understand those basic foundations becomes extraordinarily important. And it takes fundamentally a different approach to teaching. But again, it all begins with a question, making the question fun, making the question interesting, making the question even into a game. What about the roll of toilet paper? What's the question? And why a roll of toilet paper?
How many sheets?
Yeah, what's the volume?
What's the volume?
Yeah, the roll of toilet paper. But why a roll of toilet paper? Well, there's a pedagogical reason. You know, you tear off sheets, or mathematical reason. Tear off sheets, that's part of the volume. You start with the area of the sheet, talk about the relationship between the area of the single sheet and the whole volume. But there's another reason why he chooses a roll of toilet paper.
Think about it every day.
And at odd moments. Yes. And because it's crazy. He says, I don't ask big questions like Melissa does. I ask crazy questions, which the students will giggle about and have fun with, and we can all have fun with it. I can throw the roll of toilet paper at them after I get through. You know, and we can just have fun with it. And it just treats it as a game and tries to create, this is extraordinarily important, that non-threatening atmosphere that they must have to be able to confront those questions. You know, we've created in our apparatus of teaching and learning all sorts of things that destroy that non-threatening atmosphere and make it very threatening to students. You think about your own learning, for example, as a scholar in your field. You're working on a paper. You take it down the hall, show it to a colleague. You'd be terribly insulted if they looked you in the eye and said, "You're making a C thus far." You'd expect some substantive feedback so you could go back and rework the paper. You'd expect that opportunity to be able to try, come up short, get feedback, try again. But do we give that opportunity to our students? No. Instead, instruct, then test, the test counts. Instruct, then test, the test counts. So we don't create that opportunity for students to try, fail, receive feedback, and so forth. And the conceptions, the paradigms they have of themselves become extraordinarily important. How many of you are familiar with Carol Dweck's work? Anyone? It's extremely important. She's a psychologist, a social psychologist now at Stanford, spent a number of years up at Columbia, and before that, the University of Illinois. And she's worked with this concept she calls mindsets. And what she's found is that the mindsets that one has will be more influential in achievement than any measures you could make of something called intelligence. And the mindset she's talking about are students' conceptions of intelligence. And those conceptions, she's found, fall into one of two broad categories. One category is the conception that intelligence is fixed, and it's fixed for life. You're born with a certain IQ, that's it. You can stamp it on a child's forehead, that's what they have. 178 or 78 or somewhere in between. And they go through life like that. That's their conception of intelligence. But there's another conception she's found among students, even as young as 5 and 6 years of age, and that persist on through college and adulthood. And that other conception is that no, intelligence is not one central quality. It's many different abilities, and any one of those is malleable, stretchable by hard work, by effort. And it largely depends upon effort. Now, she's looked at students with both fixed and flexible views of intelligence. And what she's discovered is that those with a fixed view of intelligence are far more likely to develop a sense of helplessness. That's perhaps pretty clear why someone who viewed themselves as down here would develop a sense of helplessness. I can't do math. I'm down here. This is where I'm fixed. But she's also found that students with a fixed view of intelligence who have themselves fixed at the top can also develop that sense of helplessness. And perhaps typified by one young lad who was featured in a New Yorker article about 5-6 years ago. He attended PS, I think it's 57 in Manhattan. It's a school that requires students, as they enter as 6-year-olds, to take an IQ test. And you have to score in the upper 1% to get into this school. He not only scored in the upper 1%, he made the highest score that anyone had ever made on the test. But at age 11 and 12, his parents and his teachers described him as a student who was totally uninterested in anything. He was totally uninterested in anything because, you see, he was afraid to try anything. He had been told all of his life, you're a genius. It was part of his own self-image. And if he tried something new and failed, that would call into question that basic image that he had of himself. And so she's found that students who have that fixed view of intelligence will often develop a sense of helplessness, whether they fix themselves at the top or at the bottom or somewhere in between. Well, if that's the case, then the important question is, can we change their conceptions of intelligence? And there's been a lot of research on that question. Well, some of the most interesting was done by Lisa Blackwell. I invite you to look at her research in chapter 4 of a new book out about a month ago entitled What the Best College Students Do. Plug, plug. So look at Lisa Blackwell's research. But what she found is some very interesting ways of changing students' concepts of intelligence and thereby changing their performance in math, dramatically changing their performance in math and their whole approach to the study of math, because they began to see that perhaps their abilities could grow and there was nothing static about them. The work that Melissa Kamens has done has found that the kind of feedback you give to a student can have an influence. Two different kinds of feedback. One kind of feedback is person-oriented feedback. Another kind is task-oriented. Person-oriented is the kind that I gave my daughter for so many years. I'm sorry, I didn't know. I had not read the literature at that point. She's now older than I am, but she was a little girl once. And well, I'm only 39. She's 42. So that, she's older than I am. So this fixed view of intelligence, or fixed concept, she would bring me her work, and I would say to her things like, "Oh, what a smart little girl you are. That sounded good." But Carol's research, Melissa's research, Lisa's research suggests that a steady diet of that person-oriented, even praise, can foster a fixed view of intelligence. I should have been saying things like, "Oh, you must have worked very hard on this," or "How did you do this?" or "Tell me about how you did this." Orientation toward the task rather than toward the individual. And the research finds that changes in the pattern of feedback that we give to students can change their conceptions and can change their whole perspective. But key to all of this is finding that question that will fascinate the students. Perhaps by making it into a game, the way Donald Sorry does, or finding those big questions and using those questions. One of the most famous courses at Harvard, as many of you know, is Michael Sandel's course in political theory. Traditional way of teaching political theory is take about 14 books, throw them at students, say, "Here, go read these, come back and we'll discuss them." What Michael does, of course, is raise a question. And his question is, what is justice? But he doesn't just raise a question, what is justice? He raises questions about justice that the students will find fascinating, intriguing, even upsetting, and that they will struggle with. But finding those questions becomes extraordinarily important. And I want to close with one very brief story, the point of which is that little things you do can make a huge difference in the success and failures and creativity of your students. The story is about a woman by the name of Margaret Shee, who's a social psychologist at UCLA. She was at Harvard when this story took place. Margaret was aware of some earlier research that Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson and others had pioneered that had found, get this, that if you are a member of a group about which there is a pervasive negative social stereotype, that the mere existence of that stereotype within the culture can and usually does adversely affect your performance, even if you personally reject the stereotype about, quote, your kind, unquote. And it does so because, at minimum, on a subconscious level, it simply bothers you that other people may be thinking of you in terms of this stereotype. So Margaret was aware of that research, but she asked an interesting new question. She said, we have lots of stereotypes in our culture. Some are negative, some are positive. We, for example, have a stereotype, a negative stereotype, that says that women are not as good at higher mathematics as are men. You ever heard of that one? It's not true, but there is that stereotype. You remember Larry Summers? Okay. There is that stereotype that exists in our culture. We have another stereotype she noticed in our culture. And this stereotype is a fairly positive one. It says that Asians and Asian Americans are really good at mathematics. You heard of that one? I don't know where that one came from. It just, I woke up one day when I was about 25 years old, and there it was in our culture. And my daughter-in-law, who is Asian American, says it's just true. But she's kidding. So Margaret said, okay, we got these two types of stereotypes. What if we took Asian American women? And that's what she did. She created 3 comparable groups of Asian American women. They were all sophomores at Harvard. They were all in mathematically oriented disciplines. They had all comparable grades. They had comparable SAT scores. They all wanted to go to graduate school in their disciplines. In other words, she had very reliable predictors that if she gave each of these young women in each of these 3 groups the advanced portion of the GRE and mathematics, that their group performances would be indistinguishable. Those were the predictors. That's not what happened. And it was Margaret's experiment. Because you see, before they took the advanced portion of the GRE, she asked each of these young women to fill out a questionnaire. It looked very innocent. Name, address, telephone number, that sort of thing. About 9 or 10 items. The first group had a single question that was intended to subtly remind them of their gender. It was really subtle. It asked them, do you live in co-ed housing? That's pretty subtle. But previous research had found that a mention of co-ed housing would trigger a subconscious reminder of gender. Second group didn't have that question. They instead had a single question that was intended to remind them of their ethnicity. They were all Asian Americans. Those checkoff boxes, you've seen those. Not quite so subtle. And the third group had neither of those 2 questions. You now know how they did, or should. The group that was reminded of its ethnicity performed significantly better than did the other 2 groups. In psychology, this is called making something salient. So what was made salient to them before they took the test, immediately before taking the test, was their ethnicity. And they performed better. The group that was reminded of its gender, and that was made salient, did the worst of the 3 groups, slightly below the group that had no reminder whatsoever. Little things you do can make a huge influence on the learning and lives and academic performances of your students. Good luck in figuring out what all those little things are. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ken. Any questions that people feel an overwhelming urge to ask? I don't want to put it quite that strong. We've got a couple minutes if there's something that you're thinking about.
Yes, sir.
We are often encouraged to get students to fill out course evaluation forms that say good things about us. And yet,
for the camera.
Okay, and yet, that is, we're often encouraged to get good course evaluations, whatever that means. And yet, you're suggesting we want our students to care and we want them to have some emotional distress as a result of caring about these issues. Okay. Now, I suppose if you could find a way to do it like a sitcom and have everything wrap up at the end of the course, you're set. How do you manage that?
Yeah, and it's a great difficulty, and I think the provost referred to that this morning when he said, you know, you try something and sometimes it's going to make students a little bit disconnected. A couple of Scottish researchers, Noel Entwistle and Hilary Tate, did some interesting research on this. They asked this question. They said, will it depend on whether or not the student is a deep, surface, or strategic learner in the kind of evaluations that they will give a teacher? And as it turns out, the answer is yes. So if the student expects, you see, that deep approach, if they've taken a deep approach and you satisfy it, then they're likely to give you high marks. If, on the other hand, they've expected a surface approach, that is, just memorize the material, and you haven't given them things to just memorize, steps to follow, they'll give you low marks. Now, if you work out the matrix here, there's all sorts of possibilities of combinations of students versus teachers. You work that out, and I won't work it out for you, but try this, work it out. You got teachers' approaches, you got students' approaches, and different combinations of the two. If you work all that out, I think what you'll find is, and I don't know if this is good news or bad news, is that high ratings do not necessarily indicate deep learning. But low ratings nearly always indicate some kind of problem, but a different kind of problem depending on whether or not the students have taken a deep surface or strategic approach to learning. So in some sense, to really use student ratings to evaluate teaching, you not only have to ask the right questions, and often we don't. We ask about the performance of the teacher, did they return papers on time, that sort of thing, rather than did this course stimulate you to learn deeply, their conception of the learning outcomes. But even if you ask all the right questions, you still have to know what kind of approach the students took who gave these ratings. Now, I say there's always a problem if they have taken a deep approach and let's see, I'm getting confused myself here, but there's always a problem in this sense. Let's say if you've got a professor who's got takes a deep approach, and the students do not give that person a high rating, then that indicates one thing. It indicates that person hasn't reached those students educationally to help stimulate their interest in pursuing that deep approach. That's a different kind of problem, though, than the professor who has taken a very surface approach to learning and alienates the deep learner. Those are very different kind of approaches. And so in making judgments, provosts and deans and other people have to know what kind of students they are.
And what kind of faculty they are.
And what kind of faculty they are. Yeah.
Randy Bass, who's one of the pioneers of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, did a lot of his initial writing about education, about his own struggles to get tenure, which were eventually successful. But one of the things he encountered was when he was being most adventurous and trying to stimulate the kind of learning that Ken is describing, he was getting lower student ratings. But he was, by his publications, telling people about this. And I think it's a good practice generally, which in the end is in the hands of faculty, departments, and deans. Do you have a practice of faculty making colleagues aware, I'm about to teach in a different sort of way, therefore certain kinds of things may be expected to happen, particularly the first time that it's done, which was exactly what the provost was talking about. So you know he understands that. Yes.
Back around 1990 or so in Science magazine, people at Tufts University did a little experiment. They went back to their student evaluations. They had kept them, and went back to the students who had graduated 5 years earlier, and then asked them what classes were the most helpful, etc. And as you might expect, the classes they found most useful and helpful were the ones, on average, negatively correlated to their original ones.
Yeah. Well, there's this large study that Dick Light did at Harvard that Derek Bach commissioned when the first time he was president of Harvard, going back to the late 80s. And he said, Dick, I want you to find out what are those courses at this institution that students find most intellectually satisfying. So he began interviewing students and former students and so forth. And when he published his initial conclusions in 1991, he had two. One was they were courses that set very high but very meaningful standards. That is, they were standards that were important outside of the classroom and not just within the classroom. to satisfy the professor's peculiar needs. And then secondly, there were courses, as Dick put it, in which students had plenty of opportunity to try, fail, receive feedback, try again, fail again, receive more feedback, and so on and so forth, all in advance of and separate from any traditional grading of their work. And as I mentioned earlier, that usually doesn't exist.
Okay, I think we'll wrap it at this point. I wanted to remind you or let you know we have feedback forms. They're both here and up in the area where the faculty social is. Thank you very much for coming, and thanks very much, Ken.
Thank you. And can I issue an invitation to come up to Van Ness? It's not that scary. And on the night of October 26th, the College of Arts and Science there has a big read program every year. And on the night of August 26th, the big read for this year is, and I had absolutely no influence on this, is what the best college students do. And they have an event every year in which they then have the author come in, that's me in this case, and then have someone to come in and interview the author. So Carol Snyder is going to interview me in this program it's in the auditorium on the UDC campus. I believe it's 6:30 on August 26th. October 26th, right. October 26th. That's a Friday night, I believe, about 2 weeks from now. So I invite you to come up.
Thanks very much.